We, in consultation with our Portuguese colleagues, are absolutely committed to finding out what happened to Madeleine McCann. And we've been in a unique position over the last 2 years in drawing together three strands: Portuguese, UK and private investigators. And so on that basis, I still genuinely believe that there is a possibility that she's alive.
What happens when multiple governments have more to lose than to find? Madeleine McCann vanished in 2007. But what followed wasn't a race to find a child, it became a global chess match between authorities, each more concerned with narrative control than justice. While Portugal fumbled the initial scene, Germany stalled on prosecution, and the UK shielded records from its own allies. The question isn't who took Maddie anymore. The real question is who made sure we'd never know. This is not a story about one missing girl. It's a case study of how political pressure, media staging, and international diplomacy can bury the truth deeper than any grave. In international criminal investigations, cooperation between nations is often idealized as seamless, united, and transparent. But in the case of Madeleine McCann, a British child who disappeared in Portugal in 2007, what unfolded instead was a fragmented, often contradictory web of three nations operating under separate motivations, legal systems, and political interests. At the heart of it lies a triangle of jurisdiction: Portugal, the country where the crime occurred; the United Kingdom, homeland of the victim and her family; and Germany, which later claimed ownership of the most prominent suspect. 17 years later, despite global attention, millions in public funding, and 2 official suspects, no charges have been filed. And increasingly, the question is not who abducted Madeleine McCann, but why none of these 3 nations could or would bring the case to justice. Portugal, as the location of Madeleine's disappearance, had the initial and primary responsibility for the investigation. The PJ, the National Criminal Police Force, responded to the scene at apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz. What they encountered was not a preserved crime scene, but one compromised beyond repair. The McCann's friends, resort staff, and possibly others had already entered and exited the apartment before police arrived. No physical evidence had been protected. No forensic perimeter had been established. The scene had been irreversibly contaminated. Worse yet, the PJ made no immediate attempt to collect critical forensic evidence. There were no schematics drawn of the apartment, and basic evidentiary procedures were delayed. The window through which the alleged abductor was claimed to have entered showed no signs of forced entry and was freshly cleaned. Only Kate McCann's fingerprints were present. These early failings would go on to define Portugal's role in the case. Within a year, Portugal was largely sidelined, despite being the country with legal jurisdiction. After closing the original investigation in 2008 due to lack of evidence, the Portuguese police maintained possession of the core case files, but exercised increasingly little authority as other countries and media forces inserted themselves into the narrative. The PJ would remain the nominal owners of the case, but their influence steadily diminished. While Portugal held the ground, the United Kingdom controlled the family, the narrative, and the public perception. As British nationals, the McCanns were not just the victims' parents. They were politically protected citizens. The British media, particularly the tabloid press, provided extensive, often sympathetic coverage, painting the McCanns as ideal parents struck by tragedy. But behind that sympathy was a calculated system of control. The UK Home Office refused to share key materials with the Portuguese investigation. Despite repeated requests from PJ, the British government denied access to the McCanns' banking records, their mobile phone logs, and most notably, Madeleine's medical records. These were not trivial omissions. The inability to cross-check such fundamental data crippled any meaningful reconstruction of the events leading up to the disappearance. No legal justification was made public for this refusal, but the message was clear. Access to the McCanns' private data was not up for negotiation. Furthermore, political influence directly interfered with the course of justice. Then Prime Minister Gordon Brown personally contacted the Portuguese government, urging them to allow Gerry McCann to release a description of a suspect based on Jane Tanner's dubious citing a move that circumvented Portuguese police authority and protocols. At the media level, the UK government appointed Clarence Mitchell, former director of media monitoring at 10 Downing Street, to serve as the McCann's official spokesperson. His job was not investigative, but narrative to manage the family's image, shield them from scrutiny, and shape the press coverage. In effect, the McCanns had their own state-backed public relations arm. With political capital, narrative control, and media saturation, the UK assumed an outsized influence on the case while refusing to share the very data that might solve it. In 2020, Germany announced a major development: a new prime suspect, Christian Bruckner, a convicted offender and German national, who had lived intermittently in the Algarve region from 2000 to 2017. The German authorities stated they had reason to believe Madeleine was no longer alive and were treating the case as a homicide. The world paused. But 4 years later, the promised breakthrough has yielded nothing. No charges have been filed against Bruckner in connection with Madeleine's disappearance. Despite being imprisoned for a separate sexual assault conviction, his role in the McCann case remains speculative at best. The German prosecutor's office has remained vague, offering little clarity on the nature of the evidence, its source, or its limitations. When pressed, they responded simply, "There is currently no prospect of prosecution." What Germany has offered instead are publicized searches. In 2023, they conducted a high-profile search near a reservoir in Portugal, and again in 2024, they led a new excavation in Atalaya. Neither yielded any physical evidence, yet were covered heavily by international media. The lack of transparency around these operations raised questions. Were these genuine investigative efforts, or were they symbolic gestures designed to maintain the illusion of progress? Just as importantly, Germany did not coordinate fully with Portuguese authorities. Despite conducting searches on Portuguese soil, no unified task force, no shared forensic oversight, and no tangible results. Germany assumed the role of lead investigator, but withheld the critical details that might allow any other agency to verify or challenge their findings. The core issue with this tripartite arrangement was not its existence, but its complete lack of genuine cooperation. Rather than uniting around a shared investigative goal, each country treated the Madeleine McCann case as a national dilemma to manage politically, legally, and reputationally. What emerged was not a collaborative pursuit of truth, but a closed circuit of dead-end jurisdictions and paralyzed bureaucracy. Portugal, having mishandled the initial scene and failed to apply proper forensic procedures, quickly lost both investigative control and international credibility. The UK, while projecting support through political channels, ultimately withheld vital forensic records and interfered with the media narrative, thereby hindering external investigations. Germany, for its part, stepped forward with a high-profile suspect, but issued no charges and offered limited transparency, leaving the public and legal community disillusioned. And together, all three nations operated without any unified judicial mechanism, resulting in a fragmented process devoid of central leadership, accountability, or resolution. Instead of forming a tri-national task force or shared legal framework, each country worked in parallel, rarely in unison, often in conflict. Even now, evidence held by each jurisdiction remains isolated. Portuguese police maintain physical files, but no leverage. UK agencies protect data, but refuse to share. German investigators claim authority, but offer no accountability. The Madeleine McCann case is not merely a failure of one police force or a single bad decision at a crime scene. It is a demonstration of systemic failure across multiple governments, bound by ego, legal red tape, and political optics. At no point did any of the three countries rise above self-interest to form a unified, transparent approach to justice. There is no central court, no joint evidentiary review, no universal access to timelines, records, or forensic reports. Madeleine's case is a legal orphan claimed by all, owned by none. In the end, the tragedy is not only that a child disappeared, but that three of Europe's most powerful legal systems spent 17 years circling around one another, posturing, protecting, and pointing fingers while the one question that mattered most was left unanswered. Not because they couldn't answer it, but perhaps because they never truly wanted to. In most high-profile missing persons cases, the discovery of physical evidence, especially when reinforced by biological detection, should redirect an investigation with urgency. But in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, arguably the most globally recognized child abduction case in modern history, even the clearest forensic indicators were minimized, questioned, or flat-out dismissed. Not because they were inaccurate, but because they threatened the dominant narrative that Madeleine was abducted by a stranger, vanished without a trace, and that no one close to her bore any responsibility. Among the most compelling early developments in the case was the deployment of two highly trained British sniffer dogs, one specialized in detecting human blood, the other in identifying the scent of human decomposition cadaverine. These dogs, recognized internationally for their precision, were brought to Portugal and used to inspect a wide range of locations and vehicles connected to the case. Their findings were unambiguous. Both dogs independently alerted only in two places: apartment 5A, where Madeleine was last seen, and a Renault Scenic rental car used by the McCanns several weeks after the disappearance. No alerts were registered in the apartments of the other Tapas 7 holiday companions. No alerts on any vehicles, except the one used by the McCanns. No reaction at Robert Murat's property, who at the time was a key suspect. In most criminal investigations, such specificity would warrant immediate follow-up, a second round of forensic testing, enhanced crime scene scrutiny, and a strategic pivot in suspect interviews. But that is not what happened. Rather than consider these findings as a potential breakthrough, the dogs' alerts became a source of discomfort for those controlling the investigation narrative. The McCanns publicly cast doubt on the dogs' reliability. In particular, Kate McCann's now infamous response raised eyebrows. Did they truly believe that a dog could detect the scent of death 3 months later from a body that had been so quickly removed? On the surface, it was an attempt to discredit the dogs. But to many, the phrasing itself was revealing, possibly too revealing. By referencing the removal of a body, Kate inadvertently outlined an alternative scenario, not abduction, but death, and a cover-up. For a parent insisting on the belief that their daughter was alive and taken by a stranger, this was an unusually detailed and macabre hypothetical to construct. Most parents in that position resist any mention of death, but Kate's language reflected a preemptive defense, as though she already anticipated the implications of the dog's reactions and sought to disarm them. Yet what's more revealing than the McCann's reaction was that neither the Portuguese nor British authorities treated the dog alerts as central leads. There were no substantial follow-up searches based solely on their alerts. The cadaver scent identified in the boot of the McCann's rental car was not matched to any known DNA. No new lines of inquiry were pursued. The findings were not used to challenge or even revisit the timeline or assumptions previously established. Years later, Dr. Mark Perlin, a world-renowned forensic expert in probabilistic DNA interpretation, offered a solution. He proposed reanalyzing the DNA samples collected during the investigation using modern computational tools capable of identifying contributors from degraded or complex mixtures. Most importantly, he stated that he could work from the original DNA code, not the physical samples, and that he would do so free of charge. This was not just generous, it was groundbreaking. With a single algorithm and updated computing power, Perlin could either confirm or rule out matches that were previously inconclusive. In high-stakes cases around the world, his software, TrueAlile, had cracked cold cases years after physical evidence had gone stale. But in the McCann case, his offer was ignored. Neither the McCann family nor the German authorities, who had by then taken over the investigation and named Christian Bruckner as a suspect, responded to Perlin's outreach. No request was made. No cooperation offered, no explanation given. In any legitimate criminal investigation, a no-cost, low-risk opportunity to refine DNA findings would be seized immediately, especially in a case starved for hard evidence. But here, the silence was louder than the offer. Taken individually, these events may appear inconclusive. Dog alerts are not proof of guilt. A statement by a grieving mother may be emotional, not strategic. DNA analysis can produce ambiguous results. But collectively, they reveal a disturbing pattern, one that repeats throughout the McCann case. If a piece of evidence supports the abduction theory, it is promoted. If it contradicts that theory, it is discredited, ignored, or left unexplored. This is not the behavior of an objective investigation. It's the hallmark of a narrative being protected. The dog alerts, perhaps the most significant empirical finding in the case, could have triggered a new phase of investigation focused on the possibility of death and concealment. Instead, they were pushed aside. Dr. Perlin's DNA analysis could have confirmed or nullified the implications of the dog's findings. Instead, his offer was met with institutional silence. Kate's comment could have prompted a reassessment of assumptions, but was treated as an aside. The media and official narratives remained fixated on a faceless intruder. The theory of a mystery man slipping into a family's apartment and vanishing with a child, leaving behind no fingerprints, DNA, footprints, or eyewitnesses persisted unchallenged in mainstream discourse. And even when inconsistencies arose in the family's own timeline and behavior, they were chalked up to trauma rather than indicators of deeper complexity. Perhaps the most troubling part of this forensic negligence is the implication it carries about the role of authorities themselves. In a case of this magnitude, with international media, political involvement, and tens of millions spent, one would expect every tool, technology, and hypothesis to be pursued. Instead, we find evidence that contradicts the dominant theory being systematically downplayed or ignored. This is not just about science being missed. It's about how science was feared and how evidence became a liability when it challenged the pre-established version of events. Authorities weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a conclusion that didn't destabilize powerful interests or implicate protected individuals. And that is perhaps the greatest injustice of all, that Madeleine McCann is not just a missing child, but a symbol of how politics, public relations, and institutional fear can bury truth deeper than any grave ever could. In June 2020, the German prosecutor's office in Braunschweig announced that Christian Bruckner was the new prime suspect in the long-running mystery of Madeleine McCann's disappearance. Unlike previous speculative leads, the announcement came with an unusually bold statement. German authorities were now treating the McCann case not as a disappearance, but as a murder investigation. The international press responded with a mixture of renewed hope and cautious skepticism. For the first time in years, there appeared to be a tangible lead, driven by a sovereign state willing to publicly name a suspect. Yet, in the years that followed, a curious thing happened: nothing. No formal charges were filed. No new physical evidence was revealed. No public explanation clarified the connection between Bruckner and Madeleine's disappearance. And by 2024, 4 years later, Germany had still not moved the case forward in any meaningful legal sense. The same man they had placed at the center of an international spotlight remained unindicted, even as he approached potential release from prison for unrelated crimes. When pressed, German prosecutors issued a subdued and revealing statement. There is currently no prospect of a charge being filed. That single sentence raised more questions than it answered. If Germany had no intent or legal basis to prosecute, why had they seized control of the case so aggressively? Why had they bypassed collaboration with Portugal, where the crime occurred? Why had they distanced themselves from British authorities, the nationality of the victim and her family? The German legal system is not known for dramatic public gestures without substance. Its procedures are built on quiet deliberation and methodical accumulation of evidence. Yet in this case, it appeared to be operating in reverse. A suspect was named before the supporting case was made. Public declarations preceded legal indictments. The entire process was inverted. In the 4 years following Bruckner's designation as suspect, Germany undertook 2 large-scale search operations in Portugal, both heavily publicized and clearly intended to signal momentum. The first, in 2023, involved the search of a reservoir in Algarve, a location allegedly frequented by Bruckner. No concrete evidence was found, and no forensic breakthrough occurred. The second, in 2024, was conducted in Atalaya, another area not far from the original disappearance site in Praia da Luz. Again, no key findings were disclosed. Officials issued a bland conclusion: nothing of significance was recovered. And yet, both events received enormous media coverage from German outlets, European networks, and global tabloids alike. Cameras captured search dogs scouring the terrain. Drones flew overhead. Forensic tents were erected. But beneath the dramatic imagery lay an uncomfortable truth: the case remained stagnant. To fully grasp the peculiar dynamics of this prolonged stagnation, one must examine the geopolitical and judicial triangle at play: Portugal, where the crime occurred; Britain, home of the victim; and Germany, current self-appointed lead investigator. Portugal, once in charge, has long been sidelined. After early missteps in crime scene management and an intense wave of media criticism, Portuguese police withdrew from the spotlight and handed over broader access to their case files. But their access in return has been limited. German authorities now direct investigations on Portuguese soil, while Portuguese law enforcement plays a secondary, often symbolic role. The United Kingdom, for its part, has maintained its own investigation operation, strange though its scope has increasingly narrowed. Britain shares little forensic data with Portugal, and has likewise been opaque with Germany. Officially, British authorities support the ongoing German investigation, but unofficially, they seem to treat it as an external venture with its own political logic. And Germany remains the only actor asserting prosecutorial dominance without prosecuting. Despite repeated statements affirming their belief that Madeleine is dead and that Bruckner is responsible, they have withheld key data, refused to disclose case status updates, and left both the Portuguese and British authorities largely uninformed about investigative developments. The central question now looms: if Germany cannot or will not charge Bruckner, why does it retain control of the case? Several hypotheses emerge, none of them reassuring. First, narrative management. By keeping the case open but uncharged, German prosecutors preserve the illusion of forward motion. The public sees search operations, media statements, and confident declarations. This distracts from the uncomfortable reality that after 17 years, no one has been held accountable, and the original scene was irrevocably compromised. Second, institutional reputation. Admitting that the case has no viable suspect may reflect poorly not just on Germany, but on Europe's criminal justice cooperation as a whole. Bruckner becomes a placeholder, a proxy for progress. Third, avoiding judicial closure. Formally closing the case or passing jurisdiction back to Portugal would mean conceding defeat. Keeping it active in Germany allows the state to control the narrative, minimize legal risk, and appear committed, even if no results follow. What's most troubling is how the appearance of transparency has replaced real accountability. Every few months, a new statement, search, or media leak rekindles public interest. But these flare-ups generate heat, not light. There is no concrete roadmap, no charges, no real timeline. In this way, the Bruckner strategy resembles a PR operation more than a criminal investigation. The spectacle of police searches, the release of grainy photos, the confident proclamations, these all keep the public engaged while postponing the reckoning that must eventually come. This is not to exonerate Bruckner. His past is disturbing. His proximity to Praia da Luz in 2007 is suspicious. His criminal record is vile. But none of this proves he murdered Madeleine McCann. In any system of justice, even the most plausible suspect must be charged or cleared. Instead, Bruckner remains in limbo, a legal Schrödinger's cat, who is both guilty enough for media headlines and not guilty enough for formal indictment. Compounding the problem is the absence of any tri-national coordination mechanism. Germany acts alone. Portugal defers. Britain watches. There is no shared tribunal, no legal consortium, no forensic task force pooling their resources. Each country protects its turf, its data, its narrative. If Bruckner is not the man responsible, and there is no hard evidence to say He is then Germany's tight grip on the case becomes not only counterproductive, but obstructive. Every year without progress reduces the chances of discovering the truth. And every year that Germany clings to leadership without delivery, the more the entire system appears to function not for justice, but for optics. The German authorities' stewardship of the Madeleine McCann case began with promise, a declaration of murder, a named suspect, and a bold commitment to truth. But after 4 years without charges, evidence, or progress, it's time to ask whether this is still a criminal investigation or simply a bureaucratic performance. And if it is the latter, then the world deserves more than press releases and staged excavations. It deserves answers. When 3-year-old Madeleine McCann was reported missing from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal, on the evening of May 3, 2007, the urgency was immediate. But in terms of investigation, that urgency never translated into action. What followed was not a model of rapid forensic response. It was a case study in how early-stage failures avoidable and systemic can permanently damage the trajectory of a criminal investigation. Apartment 5A, instead of being preserved as a crime scene, was effectively surrendered. In missing person investigations, especially involving children, the first few hours, commonly referred to as the golden window, are vital. It is during this fragile window that evidence is most likely to remain intact, undisturbed by human or environmental contamination. Yet in the case of Madeleine, apartment 5A was never secured as a protected crime scene. From the moment Madeleine was discovered missing at around 10 p.m., and even after the local police were notified, there was no effective perimeter established. In the hours that followed, over 20 individuals entered and exited the apartment freely. This included the McCann's group of friends, known as the Tapas 7, Ocean Club Resort staff including receptionists and security guards, local neighbors and curious bystanders, uniformed officers from the PSP and later the PJ, Portugal's Criminal Investigation Force. Each entry brought with it a greater risk of disturbing trace evidence. Footprints were overwritten, potential fibers brushed away, and surfaces touched without record. A site that should have been under sterile conditions was quickly rendered forensically unusable. Even after the PJ arrived, the forensic protocol applied was far from standard. There was no thorough collection of fingerprints from the apartment's windows, doors, or surfaces. Common objects within the room, pillows, toys, blankets, were not systematically bagged, tagged, or preserved. Equally problematic was the absence of foundational techniques such as DNA swabbing from high-touch surfaces, collection of potential hair, skin cells, or fibers, use of luminol or alternate light sources to detect hidden bodily fluids. With the apartment compromised by multiple unmonitored visitors and lacking proper trace preservation, investigators lost the ability to establish even the most basic forensic narrative. Had Madeleine truly been abducted? Or had something else happened entirely within those four walls? Notably, the McCanns themselves were allowed to clean and move around the apartment after the disappearance, further complicating matters. No official registry of who entered the scene and when was maintained. By international standards, this was not a secured site, it was a contaminated zone. Perhaps the most telling symptom of investigative disarray was the lack of a detailed crime scene map. In well-managed cases, investigators are expected to create a diagram within hours, recording the position of each piece of furniture, the state of all doors and windows, locked or open, the placement of toys, clothing, and belongings, the exact location of the twins in their cots and Madeleine's bed. In apartment 5A, no such mapping was created until much later, after the scene had already been disturbed. When attempts were finally made to reconstruct the layout, they relied heavily on memory and photographs taken after the fact, introducing a high level of uncertainty. This oversight created lasting damage. Analysts could not determine with confidence whether any entry or exit points had truly been disturbed. Assertions about a possible break-in through the bedroom window, for example, were later challenged and contradicted, but no physical baseline existed to test these claims. Adding further instability to the timeline were the inconsistent testimonies from the Tapas 7, the close-knit group of friends vacationing with the McCanns. During multiple police interviews, their statements varied in troubling ways. Different accounts of dinner timing. While some claimed they began eating around 8:30 p.m., others recalled different start and end times. Contradictions about child checks. There was no consensus on who checked on which children, at what time, or how long they were gone. Ambiguity around sightings, for instance. Jane Tanner reported seeing a man carrying a child at 9:15 p.m., but no one else at the table seated just meters away corroborated her observation. And Jerry McCann, who had just returned from checking on Madeleine moments before, did not see the figure either. The lack of synchrony among the adults' recollections eroded the reliability of the timeline. In a case so dependent on time-sensitive movement and observation, these inconsistencies proved highly damaging. The police, lacking solid forensic ground to work from, were forced to rely on these variable witness statements. But without physical anchors, DNA, fingerprints, blood traces, their ability to cross-validate was crippled. The cumulative impact of these failures was catastrophic. The original forensic state of apartment 5A was never documented, preserved, or understood. Every major hypothesis, abduction, accident, cover-up requires a stable foundation of time and evidence. But in this case, even the fundamentals were lost. If someone entered or exited through the window, their footprints or touch traces were likely erased or obscured. If Madeleine had died within the apartment, as cadaver dogs later suggested, the lack of early sample collection left that possibility unverifiable. If someone within the group had seen or heard something important, the passage of time and memory contamination made it impossible to know for certain. International forensic consultants, including British experts later brought in through Operation Grange, have publicly criticized the initial handling of the scene. One senior official described it as a total breakdown of basic protocol. Indeed, once a crime scene has been altered through traffic, mishandling, and omission, it can never be returned to its original state. And without that foundation, truth becomes speculation. Apartment 5A was supposed to be the starting point for uncovering what happened to Madeleine McCann. Instead, it became a symbol of systemic collapse. The absence of proper procedure, the refusal to lock down the area, and the chaos of conflicting testimonies created a perfect storm of confusion. The most important hours in the case, the hours when Madeleine could have been saved, or the truth revealed, were lost to disorder. Even now, nearly 2 decades later, forensic experts refer to Apartment 5A not just as a missed opportunity, but as a cautionary tale. A child vanished. The evidence did not. But the system failed to protect it. In most criminal investigations, memory is fluid. Over time, details shift, perspectives evolve, and inconsistencies naturally emerge. Witnesses forget, or remember differently. But in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, a peculiar anomaly persists, an anomaly that has gone largely unchallenged by those in power. Since 2007, the 7 close friends who dined with Jerry and Kate McCann on the night Madeleine vanished, collectively known as the Tapas 7, have maintained an almost eerie consistency in their statements. Not a single one has publicly revised, retracted, or contradicted the core elements of their testimonies. They all affirm they dined at the Tapas restaurant on May 3, 2007. They took turns checking on their children throughout the evening, and no one noticed anything unusual until Kate raised the alarm. On the surface, it appears coordinated. But beneath that coordination lies the deeper issue. This consistency has gone untested. No investigative authority, not Portuguese, British, or German, has aggressively pushed for cross-examination, re-interviewing, or forensic-level reconstruction of those testimonies. Instead, a remarkable pattern of institutional passivity has emerged. Each country, Portugal, the UK, and Germany, has sidestepped the Tapas 7 in its own way, effectively shielding a core group of witnesses from the very scrutiny that could unlock the case. One quote, in particular, has become emblematic of how the narrative was controlled from the very beginning. When asked by media outlets about the events surrounding Madeleine's disappearance, David Payne, a senior figure in the group, responded bluntly, "This is our matter. All comments go through Jerry." The implications were unmistakable. It wasn't just that the group wanted privacy. It was that only Jerry McCann would be allowed to speak, and any deviation from that line would be silenced internally. The phrase, "This is our matter," suggests more than just solidarity. It implies a coordinated strategy, a shared understanding to protect something or someone. And yet, none of the authorities challenged this control. No prosecutor demanded public transparency from the group. No judge compelled them to testify under oath about their movements. The statement stood unchallenged and unexamined for nearly 2 decades. In 2007, Portuguese police proposed what would have been a routine but vital step in any serious criminal investigation: a full forensic reenactment of the night in question. The goal was clear. With timelines conflicting and key facts missing, the only way to verify the group's narrative was to return to the Ocean Club resort, walk through the sequence of events, and physically demonstrate who moved where and when. The Tapas 7 declined. All of them. Citing trauma, media harassment, and legal concerns, the group refused to participate in any form of formal reconstruction. There was no legal obligation to compel them, and the request quietly faded. This refusal should have raised alarm. In any unsolved disappearance, particularly involving a child, such non-cooperation from central witnesses would normally trigger legal escalation. But again, none came. No international pressure, no diplomatic push, just silence. In 2020, while public attention shifted toward Bruckner, an essential part of the original timeline remained untouched: the Tapas 7. From 2011 to the present, not a single member of the Tapas group has been re-interviewed by German authorities. For a country claiming to lead the international investigation, the omission is staggering. Even basic investigative logic would require reviewing prior witness testimony, especially from those who were physically present at the scene. Investigative journalists, legal analysts, and even former detectives have asked the same question. If Bruckner truly is the key suspect, why is there no attempt to reconfirm or challenge the only timeline available from the Tapas group? What if the timeline itself is flawed? What if the absence of contradictions is not proof of accuracy, but a result of orchestration? Over the years, this silence has been mistaken for unity, and this unity for innocence. But 17 years later, it demands a different lens. Because this is not just about what the Tapas 7 have said. It's about what they have never been forced to say again. No member has ever broken ranks. No member has leaked new information. No member has admitted doubts or revisions, not even in private, anonymously, or under oath. In high-profile cases involving multiple witnesses, this level of uniform silence over nearly 2 decades is unheard of unless there is a shared, protected interest being guarded, whether legal, reputational, or otherwise. And authorities from 3 countries have either chosen or agreed not to interfere with that silence. British police labeled the Tapas group as witnesses only. Portuguese police, after early conflict and political pressure, backed off. German prosecutors, despite holding the loudest microphone in recent years, have never publicly acknowledged the contradictions in the Tapas group's original account. What happens to justice when silence becomes a shield? What happens when 3 governments, each with jurisdictional stake and moral duty, fail to compel a group of critical witnesses to cooperate fully, truthfully, and repeatedly? At the heart of this case lies a disturbing reality. No one ever forced the Tapas 7 to answer hard questions. Not Portugal, not the UK, not Germany. Their unity has been treated as evidence of clarity. But in truth, it may be the most telling clue that something was wrong from the very beginning. And so, we are left with one inescapable question, one that should have been asked years ago. If there is nothing to hide, why has the silence lasted so long? When Madeleine McCann disappeared in 2007, the Portuguese justice system was thrust into the international spotlight. But beneath the global media frenzy lay deeper tensions between national sovereignty and foreign influence, between procedural integrity and political damage control. Central to this unfolding crisis was a series of controversies involving the Portuguese police, including the legacy of an earlier case, the 2004 disappearance of Joana Cipriano. The consequences of that case, and how it was exploited during the McCann investigation, reveal a troubling pattern, where institutional failures were both obscured and magnified for strategic ends. In 2004, the Portuguese justice system confronted the tragic disappearance of 8-year-old Joana Cipriano. The child vanished from a small village in the Algarve, and her mother and uncle eventually confessed to murdering her. However, those confessions quickly became the subject of legal and ethical controversy. The mother was photographed with visible facial bruises, prompting allegations that the confessions had been obtained under duress or even physical violence. The allegations did not stop there. Several officers involved in the case were accused of coercive practices. One was ultimately convicted for falsifying official documents and received a suspended sentence. The broader implication was clear: there were serious questions about how vulnerable suspects, particularly in child-related cases, were treated under interrogation. Although no criminal conviction was brought against all officers involved, the justice system itself came under scrutiny. The episode cast a shadow over future investigations, raising concerns about procedural transparency and institutional safeguards. These events, though legally resolved, became a latent vulnerability within Portuguese law enforcement, a weakness that would be exploited just 3 years later. In May 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann went missing from her holiday apartment in Praia da Luz. The local police, under the PJ, opened a case that quickly attracted international attention. As initial abduction theories failed to yield results, investigators began to consider alternative explanations, including the possibility that Madeleine had died in the apartment and that her body had been hidden. While this line of inquiry fell within the boundaries of criminal procedure, it ignited a backlash, especially from British media and political channels. Rather than engage with the material evidence, much of the focus shifted to the personnel in charge. The earlier Joana Cipriano case was resurrected in full force. Editorials and headlines questioned the credibility of Portuguese police leadership, citing past allegations of forced confessions as evidence of incompetence or bias. The effect was immediate. By October 2007, after sustained pressure from the press and diplomatic bodies, the leadership of the Portuguese investigation was reshuffled. The focus of the investigation also shifted, and critical early findings such as the involvement of cadaver dogs or discrepancies in witness timelines were minimized in subsequent public narratives. This was not simply a personnel decision. It was a pivotal moment in which the Portuguese state, facing overwhelming external influence, compromised its own institutional autonomy. The justice system's ability to lead a sovereign investigation was eroded, replaced by an approach tailored to satisfy international optics. In 2008, following his removal from the case, a former Portuguese investigator published a book detailing his interpretation of the investigation. The book suggested that Madeleine had died in the apartment and that her body had been concealed. The McCann family responded with a libel lawsuit in Portugal, claiming emotional harm and reputational damage. Initially, the Portuguese courts sided with the McCanns. The book was banned and financial penalties were imposed. But the case did not end there. After a prolonged legal battle, the matter escalated to the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR. In 2021, the ECHR ruled in favor of the author, affirming his right to freedom of expression under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. This judgment had significant institutional implications. It clarified that state agents, provided they speak within legal bounds and rely on existing case information, retain the right to express professional opinions, even when those views contradict politically or publicly accepted narratives. The decision was not an endorsement of one theory over another, but rather a reaffirmation of procedural fairness and speech protections within the justice system. The ruling highlighted a paradox. While Portugal had initially suppressed critical internal voices, a supranational court had to intervene to restore balance. This external validation underscored the need for stronger internal mechanisms of legal independence, so that national institutions do not yield so easily to political or diplomatic pressure. In retrospect, the international dismantling of Portuguese investigative authority had long-lasting effects. Once the credibility of the domestic police was undermined, further inquiry into alternative hypotheses became politically toxic. State authorities found themselves constrained not by legal principles, but by public relations imperatives. As a result, critical avenues of inquiry remained unexplored or underanalyzed. The Tapas 7 group, close friends of the McCanns, who were among the last to see Madeleine, were never thoroughly re-interviewed by German authorities after 2011, despite their central role in the timeline. Forensic inconsistencies were sidelined. Requests for reenactments of the night of the disappearance were refused, and Portuguese authorities appeared increasingly reluctant to challenge the prevailing interpretation of events. By individualizing past institutional errors, pinning them on one figure or one department, Portugal effectively deflected attention away from deeper structural issues. Instead of reforming processes, updating forensic protocols, or securing interagency cooperation, the state retreated. The cost was not just reputational, it was operational. The case stalled for years, mired in ambiguity, not because evidence was lacking, but because the system had lost the legitimacy to pursue it without interference. The intersection of the Joanna Cipriano and Madeleine McCann cases offers a cautionary tale. It shows how allegations, even unresolved, can be weaponized in the media to destabilize ongoing investigations. It illustrates how states can lose control of their own legal processes under diplomatic and political pressure. And it demonstrates the importance of maintaining institutional integrity, especially when the stakes involve missing children and international credibility. Portugal's justice system, under siege from within and without, chose a path of retreat. By allowing a single controversy to taint an entire process, it weakened its standing and muddied the waters for any future investigation. Whether or not the truth about Madeleine McCann is ever discovered, the case has already left its mark on how countries must defend not just their borders, but their institutions. The real story here is not about one officer's actions, but about how a state's legitimacy can be dismantled by selective scrutiny and external noise. And until states learn to uphold their institutions in the face of such pressure, justice will remain as fragile as the systems meant to deliver it. In the days following the disappearance of Madeleine McCann in May 2007, a series of highly coordinated actions by British authorities marked the beginning of an unusual and unprecedented level of state involvement in a foreign police investigation. At the heart of this effort was Clarence Mitchell. His sudden presence in Praia da Luz raised questions not only about the scale of the response, but also about the real intent behind his assignment. Soon after arriving, Mitchell transitioned from a temporary government liaison into a full-time media advisor and official spokesperson for the McCanns. He would later leave public service altogether to work exclusively for the couple, a move that effectively merged the machinery of government communications with the private interest of a family at the center of a criminal investigation. Under his guidance, press interactions were carefully curated. Access to the McCanns was filtered, messages were centrally managed, and any narratives diverging from the official abduction theory were downplayed or ignored. The image of a grieving but innocent British family became the global face of the case, reinforced daily through consistent and polished media exposure. What was originally framed as compassionate support began to resemble an information control campaign, unprecedented for a missing child investigation overseas. The reach of British governmental involvement extended beyond the realm of media. According to multiple reports and confirmations from Portuguese investigators, Gordon Brown, then Chancellor of the Exchequer and soon-to-be Prime Minister, personally contacted high-ranking officials in Portugal within days of Madeleine's disappearance. This direct political pressure allegedly played a crucial role in swaying Portuguese authorities to allow Jerry McCann to publicly release an artist's sketch of a suspect based on the testimony of Jane Tanner, a member of the McCann's travel group. Tanner claimed she saw a man carrying a child on the night of May 3, yet her description was vague and conflicted with other witness timelines and surveillance footage. Despite these inconsistencies, her account became one of the earliest and most widely circulated narratives about a possible abductor. Many within law enforcement circles questioned why such an uncorroborated detail was allowed to frame the investigation's direction so early on. Brown's intervention, though presented publicly as a display of empathy for a family in distress, signaled a deeper issue: the overt political influence exerted by a national government on an active investigation in another sovereign country. While diplomatic support is customary for citizens in distress abroad, what unfolded in the McCann case was far more assertive an effort not just to assist, but to steer and shape the flow of events. It introduced a new layer of complexity, one in which political optics, rather than investigative logic, began to dominate. Even more troubling was the British Home Office's reluctance to cooperate fully with Portuguese investigators. As the PJ worked to reconstruct events and timelines, they made formal requests for key records, namely the McCann's mobile phone activity, their financial transactions during the holiday, and any relevant medical files. These documents could have either solidified or ruled out several theories, including ones that diverged from the abduction narrative. Yet the Home Office either refused outright or provided limited, selectively redacted information under the pretext of protecting personal privacy. This lack of transparency hindered Portuguese investigators from conducting a comprehensive inquiry. It created a one-sided dynamic in what was supposed to be a joint investigation. In many criminal cases involving international jurisdictions, cooperation on data sharing is standard protocol. The refusal to share critical data thus stood out as both unusual and obstructive, adding to the perception that British institutions were more concerned with shielding the McCanns than uncovering objective truth. Perhaps the most defining feature of the early investigation was the rapid internationalization of the case, not to broaden search efforts, but seemingly to manage the narrative. Within 72 hours of the child's disappearance, the McCanns were thrust into the global media spotlight. High-profile interviews with BBC, Sky News, and CNN followed in quick succession. Photographs of Madeleine circulated around the world. Donations poured into the Find Madeleine Fund. Political leaders, celebrities, and religious figures issued statements of support. This blitz of publicity was orchestrated, not organic. It was supported by professional public relations firms and legal teams, some of whom offered their services pro bono. The immediate transformation of a local disappearance into a global event raised eyebrows. Typically, missing persons cases, even those involving children, do not receive such treatment unless there is credible evidence of cross-border crime or international trafficking. In the McCann case, the theory of abduction was assumed from the beginning, long before forensic evidence or witness statements could confirm or deny it. Other possibilities, accidental death, concealment, or family involvement, were marginalized, even when raised by official investigators. This global media strategy produced two lasting effects. First, it exerted diplomatic pressure on Portuguese authorities, who now found themselves accountable, not only to their own justice system, but to an international audience. This placed them under scrutiny and political duress, often with little room to pursue leads that challenged the British narrative. Second, it shaped public perception in a way that insulated the McCanns from serious criticism. Any deviation from the abduction story was seen not as investigative prudence, but as an attack on grieving parents, an approach that discouraged open discourse and further isolated the Portuguese investigators. In retrospect, the unprecedented involvement of British political and media figures transformed the Madeleine McCann case from a criminal inquiry into a geopolitical saga. While the original intent may have been to support a family in distress, the level of orchestration, narrative control, and selective transparency point to a much broader agenda. The question remains, was this purely a humanitarian effort? Or was it a concerted attempt to control the outcome of the case both legally and in the court of public opinion? In either scenario, one consequence is clear. The case was never allowed to unfold naturally. Investigators in Portugal were hamstrung, alternative theories were stigmatized, and public discourse was tightly managed. Today, nearly 2 decades later, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains officially unsolved. But the political machinery that rose up around the case may have solved something else, entirely the management of a story too big, too delicate, and too political to leave to chance. "17 years have passed since 3-year-old Madeleine McCann disappeared from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. Despite waves of media coverage, repeated declarations of new leads, and 3 national law enforcement agencies involved at various points, the most striking fact remains: no one has ever been charged with her disappearance. Not a single individual, whether initially suspected, publicly named, or quietly investigated, has faced trial. The criminal justice process, it seems, has stalled indefinitely, not due to a lack of suspects but due to a lack of will. Since 2007, not a single arrest has led to formal prosecution. Multiple suspects were floated at different times: Robert Murat, Kate and Jerry McCann themselves, and most recently, Christian Bruckner, but none of them has been indicted. Each has been scrutinized to various degrees, yet the system has seemingly found reasons to withhold action in every case. That absence of resolution is no longer just a procedural gap. It has become the defining feature of the investigation. This prolonged inertia cannot be blamed solely on lack of evidence. Numerous lines of inquiry witness testimony, forensic signals, behavioral red flags were opened and then abandoned. The investigation seems to have entered a holding pattern, where closure is neither actively pursued nor officially dismissed. It's a strange, unresolved limbo. In 2020, German authorities publicly named Christian Bruckner, a convicted offender, as the prime suspect. They asserted that they had concrete evidence. He was responsible for Madeleine's disappearance. The announcement made international headlines. But as of 2024, the Office of the German Federal Prosecutor has quietly admitted that there is currently no prospect of a charge being filed. 2 highly publicized searches of land near Algarve were conducted in 2023 and 2024, led by German investigators in cooperation with Portuguese police. Both yielded no forensic results. Not a single hair, fiber, or traceable item connected to Madeleine was recovered. More striking still is that Bruckner has not been publicly interrogated about the case. He remains imprisoned for unrelated offenses, with the Madeleine file resting silently beside his name. For all intents and purposes, his status as prime suspect exists only in press releases, not in courts or legal proceedings. A suspect in name only, never in law. Kate and Jerry McCann were briefly declared arguidos by Portuguese police in 2007. But in 2008, this designation was lifted. Since then, they have never been subject to renewed investigation, despite inconsistencies in their timelines and behavior noted in the original case files. More critically, the Portuguese authorities' repeated requests for supplementary information, ranging from phone records and medical files to financial data, have been systematically blocked by the UK Home Office, citing privacy concerns. This has effectively created a jurisdictional firewall. While Portugal remained officially in charge of the original investigation, it could not access key data held in the UK. The McCanns have not been compelled to clarify points of confusion or cooperate with deeper forensic reviews. Their legal protection has remained intact formally and informally for over a decade. Equally shielded from scrutiny are the 7 friends who dined with the McCanns the night Madeleine vanished, collectively known as the Tapas 7. In 2007, Portuguese police requested their participation in a crime scene reconstruction to clarify timelines and observations. They refused. From 2011 onward, none of them has been re-interviewed by law enforcement, even as new investigative leadership rotated between agencies. The German police, currently holding the lead role in the Bruckner probe, have not approached them. This is despite their testimonies containing multiple contradictions about who checked on the children, at what times, and what they saw or didn't see. Their accounts have remained perfectly synchronized for 17 years, an anomaly in criminal history. Most investigations involving multiple witnesses see memory shifts, divergent details, and revisions over time. Here, the uniformity is eerie, and it has been allowed to persist without challenge. By 2022, the UK's Operation Grange, the task force originally set up to reinvestigate the case, had quietly transitioned to an administrative status. No field work, no forensic reanalysis, no fresh witness interviews. Its remaining officers serve a paperwork role, not an investigative one. Portugal's Polícia Judiciária, while technically maintaining jurisdiction over the original case, has been relegated to a supporting role since 2020. All active searches are now driven by Germany, with Portugal and the UK trailing passively. Meanwhile, the German prosecution, despite holding Bruckner's file, has made no moves toward indictment or trial. There has been no public commitment to new evidence gathering and no signal of courtroom intentions. The phrase, ongoing investigation, is now repeated only when journalists ask. What began as an international search for a child has degraded into bureaucratic theater-staged announcements, silent files, and legal hesitation. It's tempting to frame the Madeleine McCann case as a failure, a tragedy of lost time. Human error and investigational missteps. But what if it's not a failure? What if it's a decision? Because here's what we now know: no suspect has been tried, despite years of potential. Key data was withheld, permanently stalling investigative avenues. Witnesses were allowed to refuse cooperation without consequence. Agencies shuffled responsibilities until none bore accountability. And through it all, media management remained tightly controlled. All of this does not feel like the natural unraveling of a hard case. It feels like quiet agreement, an implicit understanding between institutions, perhaps even across borders, that this case is better unsolved than confronted. It might not be possible to prove such a strategy on paper, but its pattern is observable in the outcomes. Every opportunity to reignite the investigation has been bypassed, every difficult question redirected, every official action neutralized by another agency's silence. 17 years on, the case is not dead because it is cold. It is cold because it has been allowed to die.